Welcome everyone to the Southeast Asia Climate Adaptation and Resilience Alliance. This is a joint collaboration that kicked off. The first time we had this discussion was in COP27, and the genesis of this was to contribute to the advancement of adaptation and resilience in the region. I have a huge distinct privilege to invite Nigel Topping. Nigel was the high-level champion of COP26 and is a true climate champion and has done many million miles around the world to push this agenda. And Nigel, we really appreciate your support of Southeast Asia and love to invite you up for opening remarks.
Right, it's good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for the warm welcome. I want to start by congratulating BCG, Think City, and WWF for this work. I talk a lot about radical collaboration, and it's great to see a combination of partners bringing very different skills from the public sector, the private sector, and from whatever we call the WWF sector, the third sector. Of course, BCG have been particularly supportive of all my work in the Champions over the years. They gave a lot of support as we launched a Champions team and gave us some real professional discipline and program management in that. And I can see their fingerprints all over this report, and also the technical expertise on the analytics side. They're also really great. I think the report does a fantastic job, of course, as it must, in starting out by naming the problem. But then going beyond it, and what I particularly enjoyed in the report is a very rich set of case studies, actually an unusually rich set, which takes the port, all reports like this, which are quite large in scope, right? The whole of Southeast Asia and everything from water to infrastructure to health, risk being somewhat abstract. So I think that commitment, and I'm sure that's come from the partnership with Think Cities and all the relationships with city governments. And of course, this crystal clarity which WWF bring. And again, I always think of Manuel Pulgar Vidal, who of course is now one of the key leaders at WWF, as being the godfather of the action agenda and of the role which I had for 3 years. Three things particularly struck me about if you like, the sort of macro call to action in terms of the scale of the challenge and the opportunity. Firstly, I hadn't personally understood quite how huge an economic power these countries in Southeast Asia are going to be by 2030. I think often overshadowed by some larger neighbours, right? But that's a really important point to start with, I thought, about the economic significance, because I think we all know that will get the attention of decision makers in the public and private sector, unfortunately, often more than the human story about challenge. So it's good to be clear on that. Also, the importance of the region in terms of biodiversity hotspot, and then finally the massive economic and, of course, human vulnerability to climate impacts if we don't really act on adaptation and resilience. Just a couple of thoughts about where next. I think it's really impressive what you've done in a year, and I would really love to see next year a much bigger list of partners and a much clearer focus on action, like what's actually going to happen next. And just a couple of thoughts about what might be helpful to frame it. I think the Stern-Songway, Nick Stern, Vera Songway, and Amma Bhattacharya published their first report on financing climate action, which we commissioned last year in Egypt. And for once, actually, adaptation and resilience is often forgotten because people end up just talking about energy finance, right? And energy finance is a big part of it, and of course there's an overlap with resilience. Access to sufficient energy is a way of making lives and livelihoods more resilient. But the adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage finance is often forgotten. So I would encourage you to look at the second edition of that paper, which is more granular, and see what you might be able to do to make that Southeast Asia specific, because understanding how much money is needed and from which sources it will need to come from across multilateral finance, which tends to be the major focus in the COPs, but is actually only quite a small part of the finance, domestic resource mobilisation. And I think domestic resource mobilisation in the context of Southeast Asia I think we should probably think of that both as domestic, and regional, because there are very big pools of capital in the region, and of course a huge discrepancy between some countries which will have very strong local saving pools and some countries which will have very small amounts of capital. But that kind of regional deployment of capital is also, I think, an opportunity for this work. So I think being very clear about how much money is needed and where it's going to come from is really helpful, so we don't fall into the trap of just complaining about the MDBs, because they have a role to play, but so do cities, so do national governments, so do local pension funds, so does the local private sector and international private sector. So that's one thought. I also think I like the 6 themes. It would be worth you mapping those against the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, again, because that's because once things get referenced in the decision text of the COPs, they take on a credibility which may be not warranted, but it doesn't matter. That's the real world, right? They have a legitimacy in the multilateral context, which particularly if you, as you want to partner more with national governments, being able to say that our program aligns with this framework, which has been embraced by the COP process, could be helpful. And actually, sometimes the adaptation and resilience framing, I think, is the COP. If we take the COP framing, sometimes it's not really real world. So I think it would be worth thinking about to what extent the framework you have also requires some significant bits of what are conventionally called mitigation action. There I'm thinking particularly of sufficient access to energy to live a productive life, which is not really about decarbonisation, because we're talking about families and communities who don't have access to energy don't have a decarbonisation problem. They have an economic development problem and access to sufficient energy and using the what people now call the modern energy minimum, which is the energy required to live a productive life, which is a lot more than the figure which is used to define energy access mostly. So the conventional figure is, I think, 100 kilowatt hours, 600 million people. The modern energy minimum, which means you can't just run a home but also live a productive life. So some cold storage, some solar irrigation if you're a farming family. On that measure, nearly 3 billion people don't have sufficient access to energy. So we should be, I think, using that more. And of course, energy weaves in through several of these. And the final thought I have, particularly with this emphasis on nature-based solutions, is that the high-level champions, very much driven by Dr. Mahmoud Mohidin, my colleague who will step down shortly as the Egyptian champion, but whose legacy will continue in really trying to drive pipelines of investable projects. There's this kind of boring mantra from the investment community that we have loads of capital and there's no good projects, and from the, if you like, the project community that we have loads of good projects and no capital. It's boring because everyone gets to be right and nothing happens. So I'd really like to suggest that you actually look at the work that the climate champions have been doing to try and convene the providers of capital and the originators of projects to educate each other more, because it needs to be thought of as more of as a problem solving. And I think the work you've done sets up really well with the framework, the partnership, and the analytical understanding to get into problem solving and really start to not just name the amounts of capital that are required, but actually be convening people to take ideas and needs into investable projects. And that's only done through partnership with the public and the private and the community. So I'd like to commend all the partners for a great project, and I look forward to being wherever we're going to be next year and hearing about all the great progress you've made with more partners, more projects, and capital actually flowing where it's really needed in the local areas. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nigel. I love the the call to action. Now move to action. Right, that's a great theme, and the theme around we have a lot of facts and data. Now we need to get to projects and programs, and projects and programs in nature and technology, in cities are certainly a big priority for the region. So let me just take 5 minutes. I've been given the honor of introducing the background to the report and a bit of what's inside there. as a start for us to kick off. Let me maybe start with a little bit of data on Southeast Asia. Why this is important? Why adaptation and resilience with nature, with technology, and with cities is such a big priority. It's not the only solution. I mean, there are many things that we'll need to do, but this is certainly a big part of it. So, if I then this one. Maybe you got to do it manual. Yeah. Okay. So this is what Nigel mentioned. We are, as Southeast Asia, an economic powerhouse that's also growing, right? A growing economic powerhouse with the fourth largest economy projected by 2030. So massive, and massively important for us, and certainly massively important for the globe. We're also a trading nation, trading region, both within Southeast Asia and across globally. A huge labor force that is talented, skilled, and growing as well, and a hot spot for biodiversity and nature in a very unique way. And I'll share some data around this. Might need your help on this one. So, if you look at this, you see the spider web here with Southeast Asia in the center. It just illustrates, just visually, how a stable and prospering Southeast Asia is actually important for the globe. So we're a trading region, very codependent with many other regions and countries. And if our region gets impacted severely by climate impacts on the economy, on society, and people, that impacts everyone. So that's the other reason we felt that this was very important to look at this from a Southeast Asia standpoint and contribute to that agenda. Go to next. On biodiversity, and my kind colleagues from WWF have furnished me with some really fascinating data. We are a massive biodiversity hotspot, and a couple of numbers: 15% of global forest cover in tropical regions in Southeast Asia. 76% of coral species in Southeast Asia. And coral, of course, is a big part of coastal health and resilience. And a lot of this is transboundary. It's not any one country's responsibility, right? It's across the region. So hugely valuable, and now more so than ever, protecting nature for resilience and our climate agenda, very, very important for all of us. Now, that said, if you look at the numbers on exposure to physical risk, Southeast Asia is one of the most exposed, and in many areas, the least prepared. So this is a big problem that's going to get worse, and we're not moving at the pace that's fast enough to prepare to all these physical impacts. And if you take a lens on cities and communities, today more than half the population in Southeast Asia resides in cities and communities. By 2050, this is almost going to be 70%. So the heart of the climate impacts that we're going to face are going to be in the cities and communities. So that then brings us to why the focus of this alliance around nature, the big piece that's coming up in terms of technology, AI, and advanced analytics that is a new tool for us, right? So we can use that to accelerate, advance the resilience agenda together with the power of nature, how we can use these tools at our disposal, the oldest and the newest, as some of my colleagues like to say, to advance the resilience agenda for Southeast Asia. With this background, this is then the alliance that we have formed with a focus on nature, using technology, climate analytics, AI to advance the agenda with decision-making support and centered around resilience of cities and communities. And to round it off, picking up on what Nigel was saying, the intent of this platform is to be open source and inclusive, to bring in as many partners as possible to really help advance the agenda. And with that, I'll give you the short summary. We have the report. I think it's on QR code that you'll see around us somewhere. Please do download, have a look. We have tons of case studies, practical examples of things that are already happening, already being done, in Southeast Asia and beyond, and some guidance and ideas for stakeholders who are taking action, or as a playbook, so to speak. How you can start to think about applying nature technology to advance resilience. With that, I thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your support, and very much look forward to partnering with many of the organizations here on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for that very succinct idea of what we have here and encapsulating what we are planning to do. Moving forward, we have this report, and we are now looking at talking to a bit of a group of panel. Now, we are very excited to have with us our partner, WWF, Lavanya Ramayar, who is the Director of Policy and Climate Change for WWF Malaysia, who's going to be moderating a session for us, together with Lim Aik Ho, Director of Trade and Environment Division at World Trade Organization, and Charmaine Keynes, Managing Director and Senior Partner and Global Lead in Adaptation and Resilience in BCG. That's a very long title, Charmaine. You got a lot on your shoulders. So if I could welcome the panelists to the front as well, so we could get started.
Thank you so much, Hila, for the introduction. And welcome to Charmaine and Ho. May I just call you Ho? Yes. Yeah. So now we move on to the panel session. We were supposed to have a third panelist, but unfortunately she's unwell. So let us get on with the chat on the report and what you see as how we can move forward with SEACAR. Yeah? So maybe I'll start with you, Ho. Ho has got like 25 years of experience in the international trade policy, economics and laws, and also international trade negotiations, extensive knowledge and experience of multilateral and regional trade agreements. He's a specialist in trade and environment, climate change, circular economy, and also services, domestic regulations, technical barriers to trade. Whole lot of things there that I personally don't know much about, but looking forward to learning more. And he's also on the board of UN Global Environment Outlook, GEO for business, and the ISEAL Alliance, which is a global membership organization for credible, sustainable labels, and a member of World Economic Outlook, WEF Green Trade Community. So, sorry, I'm just scrolling down, okay. So, let me ask you, Ho. We saw the presentation that Dave made. You know, the region we're talking about, Southeast Asia, is hugely rich, biodiverse rich, you know, which is, it's the nursery of the world, basically, for fisheries. It's the global rice bowl. It's also, of course, a key sink for carbon, right? And as you saw the data as well, it's projected to be the 4th largest economy by 2030. It's got the 3rd largest labor pool in the world. So from a trade point of view, do you think these implications of being so interconnected in global trade is getting the attention it deserves? Are measures being taken to ensure the resilience of supply chains, for example? And are trading rules also being developed to shift to sustainable trade that, from a climate lens, takes both climate adaptation and mitigation into consideration?
Thanks very much, Lavanya. Great to be here. Pleasure to be on this panel and this discussion. I mean, maybe it's great for me to be here also because it connects me to some work I did really at the beginning of my career. I'm actually trained not in international trade or economics in the first degree. My first degree was in land management and in urban planning. So I worked much more in issues of habitat and the built environment. But eventually I came to trade. And why so? I think partly it's because of what you're trying to do. It's that interconnection. I realized quite early on, one of my first UN conferences was habitat that was in Istanbul. And they were talking about jobs, about shelter, about cities, mega cities, global cities, and so forth. And many of the issues, had such a strong global dimension. I mean, there's a lot you can do at the city level, but a lot of what's in the city level also needs to interconnect to the national level, and then the national level to the global level. And it was that chain of developments that made me think that would be really interesting to get into much more the international trade level. Very concretely, we were working on issues of textiles factories, workers in women actually in the textile factory, losing jobs. And why were they losing jobs? And a lot of it could be traced back to international trade agreements. There was at that time a certain type of arrangement called the multi-fiber arrangement. And this set different quotas around the world, negotiated at the international level. And sudden changes of quota levels for textiles would have repercussions through the supply chain, ending up at the city level in a particular factory, in a particular situation. So it was so important to think through all of these issues. So I can commend you on trying to make these connections. Not easy, but I think very vital. You really had a great presentation about the role of cities in the global economy, the particular role of Asian or Southeast Asian cities in the global economy, and so forth. You could add to those figures trade. I mean, as you look at the share of cities to GDP, global GDP, from Asia, the large part of it is coming from cities. Jakarta accounts for 31% or more of Indonesia's total export value. It represents something like 50% of total import value for Indonesia. Bangkok accounts for 48% of Thailand's service sector. A lot of Thailand services is also internationalized. It's also part of international trade. And Kuala Lumpur, same sorts of figures. You could sort of chart all of this out. So the connections are there. And then your next big part is the impact of climate change on trade. We don't talk about this very much, that's true. I mean, we talk a lot more about the impact of trade on climate change, which is also very important, the mitigation part of it. Because just as cities will bear the brunt of a lot of climate change adaptation consequences, cities are also contributing to a lot of emissions. I mean, I believe the figure is something like 50% or so for ASEAN in terms of emissions from cities. So we do have to think about two parts, both the mitigation and adaptation part. But adaptation certainly has had far less attention. And we can see it in terms of investment. If we did some work with UNCTAD and through the World Investment Forum, most of the investment today is towards mitigation. There's very small amount towards adaptation. And to deal with many of the challenges that you're talking about, it would need quite massive scaling up of investment into adaptation technologies, for instance. So these issues are there. And a lot of trade also goes through cities. So if there's an impact on a city, it's an impact on trade, and that has a global impact, and so forth. What can one do about this? And I think there are different tools that you can think of. Not all of them are necessarily going to be in the jurisdiction of the local authority or the city authority, but still it's really important to be in that conversation and to be providing your views to that conversation. At COP28, we have launched this toolkit, this trade policy tools for climate action. And in here, I think there's quite a few pathways that could help you as well in thinking about what you could be doing in linking up. One that we've emphasized here, which I think speaks a lot to cities, is government procurement. Government procurement globally accounts for 13 trillion annually. That's a huge amount of potential capital. Now, if that is directed more towards issues of adaptation and so forth, that is something that you could really work with. And of course, a lot of government procurement is also at the local government level, as at the municipality level, and so forth. So that's one possible tool. And another one is advocacy for certain things that you already talked about. You were asking me, Lavanya, about the WTO and what is it doing from a trade agreement perspective. We concluded, or the members of WTO concluded just last year, the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, which is an agreement to eliminate fisheries subsidies that go towards illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. It's part of the SDG. It's the target under SDG 14.6. So the agreement is concluded, but it has to be ratified. Now, I don't want to point names to countries, of course, but in Southeast Asia, you know, the number of governments that have actually ratified this agreement are less than my 5 fingers, you know. So there's a big scope here to do this. So let me stop there and pass back to Lavanya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ho, for giving us that broad and wide picture of why trade is also such a key part of this conversation. And indeed, in our report, we have one chapter, the first chapter, which is about the vulnerability of Southeast Asia really being a global vulnerability. Yeah, and I think it ties into what Nigel was saying about making sure that we are connecting with what's happening, in the negotiation sphere as well. If you look at the 6 thematic areas, most of them are related to what's being discussed in the thematic, from the thematic perspective for the global goal on adaptation. But trade is something that I don't think we've brought in, and I think your perspective and what you just shared really shows why it has to be part of it. It's not that it's a regional vulnerability, so it's a local issue. No, we are so trade integrated that whatever happens in one region impacts the well-being of people, society, economy, everywhere. Now, with that, let me now turn to Charmaine. Charmaine, of course, is BCG's Managing Director and Senior Partner, and is the Global Topic Lead for Climate Adaptation and Resilience at BCG. She leads work supporting national, state, and local governments and development finance institutions in navigating the challenges of climate change and preparing robust action plans with localized solutions. She has completed a range of projects across West and Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, leveraging BCG's analytics-driven end-to-end approach to build resilience in cities and countries. Charmaine also leads BCG's engagement with large multilateral development institutions and collaborative efforts with UN agencies and emerging market governments on multi-year development programs. And earlier in your career, Charmaine, I understand that you also led BCG's consumer practice. So let's talk about another chapter, which is chapter 4 of the report, Past Meets Future, Leveraging Nature and AI for Resilience. Charmaine, you are a pioneer at this exciting intersection of past and future. And based on your vast experience, could you tell us more about this, like in the context of AI-enabled climate adaptation and resilience? What mechanisms can be put in place that ensure that investments align with priorities and long-term needs of local needs in Southeast Asia?
Thank you. That was a long introduction. I didn't realize I'd done all those things, but there you go. But thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And I do actually think it's, congratulations are due. This collaboration is bringing something new to the adaptation space, really bringing together the nature, climate analytics, and climate analytics along with communities. That sort of 3-pronged approach is not what we're seeing everywhere. So, congratulations on the report and getting this alliance going. And I see a very promising future for it. And we need it. And just, Nigel's already given a little bit of the intro as well around adaptation and where we are. And the global Sharm el-Sheikh agenda, for example, which was sort of launched properly last year, and there's going to be more about it today as the progress report is published. And I do think it's very valuable that this does link into this, and we need to continue to do that. And whilst I've got the sort of marketing opportunity, the other one I'd like to mention is that there's another report coming out today which has been done in conjunction with the US government and the PREPARE effort. And that's all about how to bring private sector into adaptation and the reasons why private sector should be interested in doing that. So I will refer to that in a moment because I think it's important for here, and there are a lot of lessons from that we could draw. But to your question around analytics and how that is being used in adaptation around the world. And as you say, we are working, I'm involved with, but we as BCG are working with governments, state authorities, cities, and also private sector and DFIs and so forth on this topic. And I think what we're finding is that bringing analytics and AI in some instances as well is incredibly powerful, because actually making decisions on adaptation is quite difficult. There are lots, it's not that there isn't data, there is data. There's data all over the place, right? There's geospatial data, there's Google, there's lots of available data if you really want to collect the data. There's lots of data on climate forecasting and so forth. But if you are a decision maker maybe as a city-state or, a government or whatever, or deciding where to allocate an adaptation fund and so forth, actually where to put that investment is not a straightforward question. Where will you get the right ROI? And this isn't an ROI which is just, what will it do economically? What will it do to that the overall GDP? Or what will it do to a particular industry sector? This is also a very socio question. So how many people's lives will be impacted if we don't do something? How many might drop below the poverty line? How many people might we need to relocate? And then, of course, the very valuable piece coming in here around the ecosystem and what will the impact be on that. And I think, as ever, when you're trying to pull together data and understanding across so many dimensions in a way that helps decision makers, it is analytics that can be really brought to bear. And so let me just give you an example of this. And actually, this was, you mentioned I've been working with some of the UN organizations, one of them being World Food Programme. And this was a few years back. But the question here was, I as the one of the senior leaders at WFP want to raise more funding from the financial sector in the US, and I need to be able to explain why I need that funding for Kenya, where there is huge drought. But I don't really have the wherewithal to say it, because I don't know how to explain the benefits of supporting farmers in this part of Kenya, and I don't know what it is that we should do. So we were able to work there with the Drought Agency of Kenya, as well as with WFP, and bring in the analytics that we're talking about here to understand actually what is going to be the impact, how much drought is there going to be, water scarcity, etc. What will that do to populations? How many people will drop below that poverty line? How many people will have to move, will have to perhaps migrate and draw upon US social services or whatever? In that case, that was quite relevant. And, what is going to be the impact on different, obviously on agriculture and other sectors, and again, also, of course, on the ecosystem. And it was through analytics that we could really bring that to bear, and we could take it a step further and say the sorts of things that you might want to do here are drip irrigation, or they are building more boreholes, or they are actually, in some places, you should just be relocating and whatever. And having that sort of fact base and ongoing ability to understand what the impact will be, and with AI, obviously, you can be updating and learning all of the time, and building that capability into the Kenya Drought Agency was, really revelatory, and as I think really enabled the right sort of action. I mean, obviously fundraising from the WFP side, but the right projects and so forth to be put in place. So it's just one small example, but I think that's the sort of thing we need to see. And then maybe if I can sort of lift up a level to, where do I think things are getting to in this space, in the adaptation arena. And it was last year when Nigel was still partly in role that, we were pulling together the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda, that Egypt, everybody will know, adaptation was much more on the stage than it had been in previous COPs. And my sense is this year, it's no longer let's talk about adaptation because we sort of need to. It's like, okay, in Dr. Razan's words, the high-level champion for COP28, who I'm sure many of you have heard speak, mitigation is critical to secure our future. But some of the people in this audience have heard me say this before. But adaptation is absolutely critical to secure today. And that's what you're seeing, not just, in Southeast Asia, daily floods, etc. And that is the reality. And so the discussions here and some of the funding commitments that have been made have been much more focused on actually what's the action that we need to take, and who needs to take it, and how do we need to take it. So I can go on for a very long time, and I'd love to talk more about how to bring the private sector in if that would be useful. But I just wanted to sort of give you an example of how analytics can be useful, and also how I do believe this is being taken more seriously. It's the other side of the coin, and I'm really delighted and congratulate those who've pulled this together. And really, I mean, the other thing Dr. Razan always says, and I think it's what we're going to see through next year, is nature has got to be right up there. It's not good enough just to talk about, other aspects of adaptation. And if you read the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda, you'll see nature is very much one of the pillars there. But I think this initiative is doing that in a fantastic way. The old friend that is nature and the new friend that is climate analytics. I'm going to stop talking there.
Thank you, Shameen. And indeed, I mean, what you say is absolutely right. I mean, nature is our ally, right? And unfortunately, and what I've been hearing, in other places as well, is we somehow are, in fact, not treating nature as an ally, but waging war with nature for some crazy reason. But it's really great to hear, both your interventions just now. One thing about adaptation, I suppose, which is more difficult than with mitigation, like you rightly pointed out, is the measurability, right? So mitigation, of course, you can measure and then you can throw the money into it. While adaptation is really about avoided losses. More difficult. And then when we look at nature, nature takes time to give the fruits. It takes a long time. And we are very impatient sometimes, we want to see the results now. We want to see quarterly results, or we want to see it in the next year or two. And that doesn't work with nature, but what nature provides is substantive. It's real, it's multidimensional, it's multi-pronged, but we have to have that patience. So, Shameen, let me just pick up from you, with you on the private sector interest. How do you see them, sort of understanding these dimensions of what maybe nature provides? Maybe AI can bring some value in that context as well. And how do we get private sector to really understand this and invest into it? Because that's what's needed.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question. And I think this measurability point is so important. And one of the ways that one can think about it and use analytics to get us there is what is the cost of inaction. So if I just talk a few moments, another case study, as I think that often brings these things best to life. So working with the Lagos state, so obviously a 27 million population, only growing upwards. It's on a lagoon, huge issues there, lots of mangrove sites along the coast there and so forth. And what we've been able to do with analytics there is to really get to some numbers. What is going to be the impact on GDP and different industry sectors? What is going to be the cost of infrastructure damage if things don't, if the climate events that we can predict happen and nothing is done in advance? What is going to be done in terms of, we talked about, lives and livelihoods? What's going to be the cost of relocating those people? What's going to be the cost of rebuilding infrastructure? What's going to be the health costs and so forth? And you can put numbers on these things. It's harder to put numbers on the nature piece, but you can absolutely talk about how much will be lost, and you can put some figures around that. And it's until we start to do that, and that's why, again, I'm encouraged by much more discussion about this year around cost of inaction as a way of helping that fundraiser I talked about, on the WFP side, but private sector fundraisers, if they can if we can bring that information to bear. So in the Lagos example, we now have a project portfolio of 20 to 30 projects, many of them nature-based solutions as well. And we're able to take those to private investors, as well as to the MDBs, et cetera, and the DFIs and so forth, but explain the cost of inaction. And there are different pieces and different returns for, different entities expect different returns or are looking for different returns. Some are more longer term in what they need, some are more shorter term, some can benefit from carbon offsets or whatever. But it's by breaking it down to that level and being able to articulate ROI in that way that one can start to bring private sector into the game. And it is encouraging that we are beginning to see that. We had another panel, I can't remember, was it yesterday or the day before, where we had PepsiCo on. We had, third largest consumer goods company. We had OCP, who are the largest fertilizer company in Morocco on. These companies are really aware that they need to make their own assets resilient, but they also know that if communities who live around those assets are being flooded and can't come to work, that's not going to be very helpful. And they also know if those communities who they sell their product to aren't able to live in that community, then that's not going to be very helpful either. So as a result, they are working with governments increasingly on, and if you can bring real tangible projects, Nigel's point about bring the project together with the funder, if you can bring examples of that and where they and align with different interests, that is our way forward. And mitigation comes into it as well. They're often, the wonderful Malaysia tunnel example. And let me just give that one example. I get very excited by this one, and it was mentioned by the Malaysian minister yesterday, wasn't it, in that pavilion? And this is not brand new, right? I don't know how many years ago it was constructed. So this is a tunnel that runs under KL. And when the weather's nice and sunny and dry, there is a toll to drive through that tunnel, which means which people pay because they want to avoid the traffic jams, above ground. However, when the rain comes down and there's floods, this tunnel is shut for cars and becomes a phenomenally important drainage mechanism for KL. That is an example of where both private sector and public sector had so much to gain, and there was an investment from many, many different parties to construct that. I think it is an archetypal example of bringing private sector in for adaptation purposes. And I won't talk to you about the Thames Barrier in the UK, which was 20 years ago, but that's another such example. So these aren't impossible. We can start to do these things.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a smart tunnel in KL that you're talking about just now. We are running out of time, but maybe let me open the floor for any questions to our panel. Anyone with any questions? No? Okay, if not, I still wanted to continue, but I wanted to give you guys the chance. But let me ask you, what do you see as something that is encouraging, or maybe one thing that's encouraging in Southeast Asia in terms of adaptation? We've talked about nature, we've talked about AI. Do you see, any encouraging signs? Because, of course, Southeast Asia is part of the global supply chain, right? So if there is anything that's going to disrupt that, it's having, repercussions, domino effect down the line. So, yeah, is there anything that you see in the region that we can sort of say, yes, we are doing this right, and this is how we need to move forward?
Well, as you would expect, most of my area of looking at things tends to be through the lens of trade policy. It's much more on the trade policy side. And there I would like to be more positive and optimistic, but I must admit, at the international level, we don't hear that much from Southeast Asian governments making that link between trade and climate adaptation, for instance, or necessarily between how to think about their climate strategies linked to their trade strategies. I hope it's coming. I think it will be coming, but it's not so present right now. That would be something I could say. At the same time, there have been past efforts, not necessarily adaptation, more mitigation, but the same logic could apply. Here I'm thinking about improving the trade conditions for environmental goods and services. This is something the ASEAN community is involved. It's involved in it through APEC, for instance. APEC liberalized tariffs on environmental goods, making it cheaper to access environmental goods, bringing them down to 0 in some cases, or to some cases 5%. And what are environmental goods? I mean, some of the most common ones would be things that you need for renewable energy generation, for instance. And you could continue that logic to adaptation. If you can identify a sets of goods and services that are needed for climate adaptation, then you think about what type of trade policies can help to reduce costs of these goods and make them more widely disseminated. And I think the trade people need that type of expertise from you, because they won't know. They will know the instruments, whether it's a tariff, whether it's a quota, whether you deal with it through that particular trade agreement. But what are the goods? What are the services? And that's what I hear a lot. That it's like they basically say it's not that they don't want to take action, but they need to know what is it that they're taking action on, and translating that into trade terms is I think a bridge that you could do. And the other one I mentioned is just the area of, work that they have already done. I mean, ASEAN, the Asian countries, they're all part of the WTO. And I mentioned earlier, the fishery subsidies agreement is already done, is already completed. But then they need to ratify it. And there, the ratification hasn't happened yet. So these are things that are out there. And the last one, I think, are subsidies. You can either think about it as mitigation or adaptation. Most of us think about it as mitigation, of course, but the big ticket items, fossil fuel subsidy reform, but there are many other subsidies out there that could be looked at in terms of repurposing, and you could repurpose that towards adaptation. So those are a few things I think you could consider. Yeah.
Thank you.
Energy efficiency is another one, but let me leave that for later.
No, thank you, Ho. I think what you've told us just now puts very nice, interesting perspective. And in fact, that's what this alliance is all about as well. For us to get various different perspectives so that, the ingredients that we put into how we come up with the solutions are really rich, are really vibrant. And I think today we've had like really excellent views from, kind of very different perspectives on how we can move forward on this agenda on adaptation. The message is loud and clear. We all need to come together and sit together and have these kind of conversations and then start acting on them, start implementing, helping the private sector, helping the trade negotiators, helping communities really get on with getting adapted to what's inevitable. The climate is changing. With that, let me invite all of you to give a big round of applause to our really excellent panel here today. And I would now like to invite my colleague, my very dear colleague, Sandeep Chamraling, who is our climate adaptation expert in the WWF network, to give us a perspective from an indigenous community lens on what nature means. Our earlier speaker unfortunately fell ill. She couldn't make it. She sends her apologies. But I'm so glad that Sandeep said, he would be willing to do this for us. So Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lavinia, and thanks for putting me over here. Well, I'm not speaking as a WWF right now, so I will just put my indigenous hat because I'm from Nepal. I belong to the indigenous community because the Rai community belongs to indigenous community, and because indigenous community are not given, you are born with that, I would say, identity. So, and wherever it's from Nepal or whether it come from South Asia or even from Latin America, I think the indigenous community are almost the same. And if I put the indigenous community hat into my right now, I see nature is really critical for the indigenous community, especially because nature is in our, I would say, in our DNA, and then because we pray nature, we rely on nature for many things. And in daily activities also, early in the morning, we pray to our ancestors, we pray to the nature for all what they have given so far. And it's sometimes really sad to see what's really happening right now, especially in terms of how the nature has been treated, how the nature has been impacted. And from an indigenous community point of view, nature is not a commodity, right? So that needs to be really well reflected. And because we see nature like our mother, right? So and because we rely a lot in terms of the nature thing. And when we look at this international process, now if we see, there is whole global goal and discussion ongoing right now. Well, the indigenous communities has been reflected, but sadly, in my whole process for last almost 2 decades in this process, I have not seen the indigenous community voice much more coming strongly, especially from the parties. The civil society are putting forward. I know like Canada is really strong on the indigenous community, for example. Some of the Latin American countries are really strongly advocating for the indigenous community. But I don't see from the Asia, and especially when you talk about Southeast Asia, none. So I think there is some missing elements that we really need to look into that particular picture. So, and And also, it's not only about the adaptation. So, for example, I think 2018, the World Bank did a study and says that by 2030, almost 250 million people will be displaced in a transboundary manner, right? So there is a lot, and most of the people, I believe, will be from indigenous community. If we look in Southeast Asia region, it's one of the vulnerable regions because of the sea level rise, and most of our cities are in very low-lying states. And we really need to look into that particular picture. And when I was looking, Dave making a presentation in terms of biodiversity hotspot in the Southeast Asia, I think we need to go back and look in terms of the indigenous hotspots in the Southeast Asia and how we can really bring them into table and make this really much more strong. And lastly, and my last point, nature is a good ally, is a sacred ally, but it has its own limits. We are really undermining that particular point. The point is, if nature is our good ally until the year 2030. If we exceed that, I would say the sink will be the source of carbon dioxide, because as we all know, as temperature increases, the impacts will be much more strongly. And the front line of those impacts is vulnerable community, and definitely the indigenous people will be one of the key, I would say, vulnerable communities. So nature is definitely our sacred ally, but we need to really scale it fast, scale it soon, and scale in the right place. I think these three things are really critical when we talk about nature-based solution. And lastly, in this all process, what I see, whenever people talk about nature-based solution, they really relate to carbon market, and which is very, very wrong. I see that often, and even in our own organization as a WWF, but that's really wrong. And if you look from indigenous point of view, indigenous people have been really saying that let's not, nature is not a commodity to trade. Nature is not a, because, and that's is really loud and clear, and we really need to bring that perspective into these things. And lastly, well, I'm also involved in this from the very beginning. We had our first meeting in last cover. They mentioned about this alliance. It's really good. I think we need to really bring the dimension from all different perspectives, bring the indigenous community, and maybe we can go back and look what are some of the hotspots of the indigenous community in our Southeast Asia region, because those, I would say, indigenous community will be one of the front line in terms of the climate victim. And there may be some of these indigenous people, I think there are already internal displacement already happening, but we can definitely see some of the transboundary displacement as we move along. And a lot of, where earlier this, I think in the day one, we got loss and damage fund operationalized. Definitely we need to bring the elements of non-economic losses into that dimension as well. So there is a lot that we can work as an indigenous community, and definitely indigenous community is not here to block everything, but how we can really sit down in table, put our voice over there, and make sure that the indigenous voice are really heard. So let me stop there. Thanks, Lavina, for that point.
Thank you.
For a big round of applause for our panelists as well as Sandeep here. And I would like to invite our managing director from Think City to come in to have to give us the closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Very good afternoon, everyone. And I think let me first start by thanking our what I call MC, our dear panelists, Lee Mike Ho, Charmaine from BCG, our partners, BCG, WWF, and my team from Think City. A year ago, it was a conversation on the corridor between Lavanya, myself, and Dave and Hila that we kind of said the voice of Southeast Asia seems to be subdued, and there was lack of what I would call coordinated collective action. And we realized that without coordinated collective action, the issue of the commons, which is our natural capital, is at risk. And we felt that being individuals and citizens of Southeast Asia, that we can't just sit and be a bystander. Rather, let's see what is it that we can do our individual capacities. This effort to put this work has been what I would call a public good effort that between BCG, Think City, and WWF that we have over the course of the last 12 months put together effort on our own to, number one, I think it's to actually bring to the fore the issue about the risk that we are faced with.
the risk of a region which is very significant globally. As we know, 600 million people, 3.5 trillion, a significant part of the global supply chain. That's all that we have heard today. And more than that, we heard also about the fact that most of Southeast Asia are coastal, and coastal Southeast Asia is at huge risk as a result of sea level rises, compounded by changing climate effect that we can see already present today because of flooding and what they call extreme heat and drought. And in fact, I'm not sure whether it's 2030 that we're going to see this, where you hit the boundary. I personally feel that it is already now present, and we are kind of are being undermined and challenged by nature. Nature is definitely a big healer, and we believe the natural capital that we have to enhance is the path forward. But to do that, we need to use the advancement in technology that will allow us to understand how can we build a better future, how can we build resilience into our own, existence. What is at risk, as I said before, is our own human existence. While we are all here at COP, I usually use this analogy to say that the house is burning on the outside and everybody inside is still partying, and there are many happy faces. And I think that part of the reason what we are trying to do is actually to bring the consciousness. And so we are going to step up our effort. The coming year, we are going to ensure that we don't leave it to this, putting a report and launching it in COP. We've done our part. Rather, we're going to take effort to go to every Southeast Asian city. We're going to connect with the government, private sector, and community so that this voice of of conscience needs to be heard, seen, and acted upon. And we hope that many of you who are in the room would help us in that journey, because this is not a journey that can be done by any individual persons. We have done our best to start a journey of 1,000 miles by taking the first step, and here's what I call the beginning of that journey by putting together the facts on the table with some thought about what should be done. It's not a perfect report. We welcome feedback. We intend to make this a live document, and hopefully that we will have iterations of this. And as we go forward, we look to see how we could actually move from what I would call call to action to move to action. And I think that's going to be the path next that we're going to chart. We are going to step up to build coalition, where we look to see how we can onboard differing stakeholders. I think in the report we highlighted those who we have engaged, those who have shown interest, and we will be expanding that. And lastly, and most importantly, I think all of this can't happen at the top-down level. It needs to be very much a bottom-up. And I hope that we can bring this to a broader public and probably showcase what non-state actors possibly could do. Because at the end of the day, Conference of Parties is actually state-led action. But then again, there's also room for non-state actors to be a critical path to define the future. Thank you very much. And I hope that you will download the report, and the links are here, and probably we will send it out to you all directly also. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamdan. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. We really appreciate it. And as Hamdan said, we are planning to increase our visibility and build the coalition, the alliance here. So if you know anybody else who would be interested in this, download the report, forward it to them, and do join us again next year if you can. Thank you.